Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello and welcome to the webinar hosted by Companion. And today we're going to have a webinar on integration testing and how to automate integration testing for finance and supply chain management. So before we start, say hi in the chat so that we can get some people and see how many have you joined here. Hopefully we have a lot of attendees. While you do that, I will jump in to the topic so that we don't spend too much time here. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Ignas. I work as a solution architect at Companion for Dynamics 365 finance and operations for finance and supply chain management. If you have been to maybe one of my previous webinars, you probably know me. If not, nice to meet you. Great to see all of you in the chat. Hi to everyone and good day to everyone. Hopefully you're having a fantastic day. The agenda that we have for today, I think it's pretty straightforward. We will focus on what is integration testing, what are the main challenges that we see, what could be the solutions, and what kind of tools do we actually have today to address those challenges, and in general, how to do this integration testing. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for some dedicated Q&A. So if you'll have some questions, you can already write them in the chat. I will address those. There is a dedicated Q&A section. You can also write your questions there. I will address those essentially when I see them. It might be at the end. It might be somewhere once I see the question appearing. Before we go into the topics, I would like to introduce you to Companion, since this is a newly created company. So some of you might have not heard of us. So let me shortly kind of introduce ourselves. So we are Companion. Formerly, we were One Click Factory. Now we are Companion. And Companion is aiming to be the predefined and the target community for any Dynamics 365 professional. We focus on the Dynamics product stack. And these are the Dynamics ERP products, Power Platform products, CRM products, CE applications, and other Dynamics 365 engagement products. I am from the technical services team. The technical services department is responsible for providing technical services to the partner organizations. So we still focus our services partner to partner, directly to partners. We do not engage with the end customers. All of our services are targeted to partners. That's why we have only the partners that are joining today in our webinar. Companion was, we essentially were born, let's say like that, only this year. So we're really kind of fresh. And hopefully you will get to know us much better in the future. And hopefully we can do a lot more engagements with you and do various kinds of activities. That said, let's go to the main topic, and that is on the integration testing. And before we go into the topic, I will try to ask you a question, and you should see a pop-up on the screen. And essentially, we are curious, how do you do integration testing, right? So it's a very simple question. You can select your choices. So it will be very interesting to see what are the results. And you can also check the total results after these are published to see how your colleagues from the community tackle this integration testing. And hopefully after this webinar, we give you some more insights and you can maybe change your answers afterwards. So while the poll completes, I will go. We will go kind of next. And if some of you have not will want to answer it later, you can. So later we will check back at the results and we'll see what will be the biggest answers from which areas. So first of all, what is integration testing? Why do we need to talk about it? Why is it relevant? Integration testing, it's when we have some kind of a business process that starts in FNO or any kind of other third-party application, and it must, in order for it to complete, you need to perform steps either in FNO or in that other third-party app. So that means that we have a multiple system involvement. When we talk about testing, it's very easy to test out the business process in FNO from start to finish, if it starts in FNO and finishes in FNO. However, if you have multiple systems, right, then you need to actually go to those systems and you need to perform, verify, or do some kind of actions on those systems. And as you know, now the ERP software is becoming more and more integrated, especially in the cloud ecosystem. You have all of your cloud services, you have all of your cloud solutions, and you can connect to these various kinds of solutions by building custom integrations. Now, these custom integrations building is one thing, but you also need to think about maintenance. In order to do proper maintenance, you will not now you essentially are tasked to knowing more, not only from FNO, but also knowing about your target systems. So the organization needs to maintain FNO tests, right, inside FNO. Plus, they need to maintain their business process test, which might span across multiple parties, across multiple services that are hosted in different in different cloud applications or on-premise applications. The biggest problem with that is that first you need knowledge, right? You need to know where that system is, what does it do. You need to know a little bit about it. You need to be able to log in, check, verify, connect to it, and do certain actions. So if we talk about automation, there is no kind of standard, I mean Microsoft built out-of-the-box toolbox where you would be able to cover integration tests that involve FNO product. FNO has a lot of toolkits available for testing inside FNO, like the RSAT, like building tests by developers, and doing other kind of tools, using other kind of tools. However, you don't have one tool that allowed you to connect to this other product, this other service, and you would be able to go through it one by one, right? So now you need to think about how do I actually, make a test that spans across these multiple systems. Also, another challenge would be that it might require integration testing environments. That means that you need to maintain some integration test environment where all of your integrations are connected. Those other services also, you need to connect to their test environments, not to the production ones. So you need to maintain a lot of connections. You need to maintain a lot of these environments that are working together. And you might be able to, and you might need to do a lot of extra maintenance that wouldn't be needed in case you have everything in one system. So how do we tackle this problem? Because integration testing still needs to be done. As the software changes, as you get new releases, new product updates, it's very important that these integrations work and you don't get any inconveniences, right? In general, we identify 3 ways how you can test out your integrations: manual, simulation testing, or end-to-end testing. A manual test, it's a test that essentially is the most straightforward one. This is when an end user performs a full end-to-end process to test out any kind of business process. So these steps involves signing into those third-party systems, signing in back to FNO, checking whether the business process has connected, whether your sales orders or invoices or whatever you're working with have been transferred, whether the messages have been received, and essentially manually checking and doing the actual business process. This is the most straightforward way to do this kind of manual test. However, it has its own disadvantages. The biggest disadvantages is that first, it's very prone to errors. Prone to errors, it means that the users, if they do it a lot, at some point they might start skipping steps. right? If you start skipping tests, saying that it will be fine, and you don't do the validation and you don't do the proper checks like you did, then you might have a lot of these errors that might come up. Also, it's not the let's say the most fun activity, and it can be very time consuming. You will need to dedicate the end users time so that they would test out these integrations regularly after releases, after Microsoft updates, after new ISV updates, and so on. You still need to kind of test out and verify that all the triggers trigger and everything works. So those users will need to spend their time, instead of doing their normal workday, to actually trigger those integrations and go through this whole process, right? So it's time consuming. And especially if we think about that, we will have this kind of strategy for the next let's say 5 years, then those users it's not a one-time activity. They will need to reoccurringly come back and do these tests. So what we usually offer is we offer simulation testing or end-to-end testing. Simulation testing, it involves usually some Microsoft tool or framework that would allow you to build a automated test, right? So to move away from manual test. And that test, the whole goal of that test is to trigger the integration framework to be able to verify that, okay, the endpoint works, the service works, the message is transferred or the message is sent, and you get a predefined outcome. The benefit of this approach is that it is relatively straightforward and relatively cheap to achieve, since it always takes a fixed income. So imagine you take a predefined XML file, predefined Excel file, and you trigger the import automatically for that file, maybe every release. So that means if you get the same file multiple times, you're always expecting the same result. If you don't get the expected result, that means it doesn't work, and you need to, your testing has essentially said that you got a negative result, so you need to check something and verify that it works. So essentially, you're simulating your third-party interactions. You're not actually calling the integration from the other side. You're building tools that would be able to kind of simulate what that system is expecting to produce. Right? So it's a good kind of middle solution because you don't need to do any manual testing. You only need to invest once into building that test and then reusing it many, many times. The downside is that it does not cover an end-to-end test. That means if something would change in the other system, for example, the other system would have some new requirements built in, or maybe the connection changes or something else, you wouldn't be able to catch it with this test. That is because the test, it expects, it works on some assumptions. And if you break those assumptions, then of course, the test will not see it, right? If you want to cover a full end-to-end, then we have the last type of testing, which is end-to-end. And it allows you to fully automate the test from one system into the other. So that is when you actually do the trigger in one system and you verify that there is an answer in the other system, right? So you do a full process end-to-end. The benefit is clear. If it works during the test, you can be 100% sure that it works in production, and you get a full end-to-end view. The downside of this approach is that it's pretty more difficult to automate. It's much more difficult because imagine you have some kind of third-party system portal that you need to sign in. So now your automation, it is supposed to simulate a sign-in. It is supposed to trigger an integration in the third-party application. Then it is supposed to come back to FNO and verify that there's a check. Right? So it's kind of like mimicking manual testing, except doing it automatically. Right? So there are not many tools that can kind of do that directly in FNO. So therefore, it's much more difficult to kind of achieve this out of the box, right? Out of the box. So if we go into more details about manual, I think it's pretty clear. It's just executing the test manual. It's not very interesting. Now, if we go into details on simulation and integrate end-to-end testing, in simulation testing, you can decide whether your test will be a technical test or a functional test. A technical test, it means that a developer will be using development tools to build an automated test. A functional, it means that a end user functional analyst will be using some tools to configure a test that can be executed multiple times. In both cases, you will need to define a very clear structure. So you'll need to define what is the service expecting, and then you will define, in case the service is expecting that, then the result should be that. So it's a very predefined, controlled environment where you set a pre-default incoming messages, and then you specify what will be the outcome, right? So for different kind of integrations, we have different kind of approaches that you can take. If we have OData and custom services, so this is a web communication-based integration strategy where we are sending web messages. In both cases, you can write for technical side, F&O developer can write some code that would call the service from within F&O with a predefined or fixed incoming message. You can have different versions of it with different items, different data. And then you essentially call the service and verify that the results post a sales order, post an invoice, or do what needs to happen, create a journal, and so on. For the functional side, we have Excel, Postman, and there are also other third-party applications that are available, which you can configure. And when you configure those applications, like a Postman or Excel, from time to time, the functional person will need to click a button, but it's only one button, run. You can also automate it a little bit. Trigger, post, and it will, for example, using Excel, create a new sales order, right? So it's still testing the data entity because, as you probably know, Excel works based on data entities. So the data entity works if the Excel creates a new transaction, for example. Same goes with the Postman tool. It's more of a technical tool, but it can be also pre-configured so that each time you get a predefined incoming message, you just click a button, send, and then you get the same result. So you verify that each time you get the same result. If we look at consuming external web services, this is when you start from F&O, and then you expect that the other system will give you some response. So again, X++ developers can automate it in an easy way by writing code. So you can write a piece of code that sends a predefined message. You receive the same outcome every time. For the functional people, there is automated UI execution. That is where the developer creates a menu item, for example. And that menu item, the user can click the button send, and then it sends that predefined message and shows the result directly. So there's multiple ways how you can kind of configure this approach, but in both cases, it would require some, in most cases, development effort, or you can use some third-party tools. If we think about the data management framework, which is also very common, and it's used commonly for this kind of integration test, then you have the data management packages, and you can use the data task automation framework. The data task automation framework, it is used directly for automatically importing or exporting a predefined data set. So as long as you have like one data set that you say this is our master data, and then you rerun it every Microsoft update, every release, every package, and then you see, okay, every single time it produces the same predefined output, right? That means it works, right? So you can mark that the test has passed successfully. And that's the way you can verify that your entities work, and you can verify that your document processes also work. For developers, there is also, they can simply write some code that calls the DMF import or export directly from F&O. And then it can produce a file, and then they can check whether the outcome has a certain field, is the amount correct, is every field correct, and so on, right? So the whole point here is that we simulate, so we don't actually engage with the other system. We expect some predefined incoming message or outgoing message, and then we build a test around it. That way, as long as that message holds true, your test will be very accurate. The only downside, as I mentioned, is that if it changes, if your base assumption change, then you might have an issue, and that doesn't reflect. If you are worried about that is a real situation, right? Some systems are very static, like they don't have any changes. And in customer environment, it can be systems that they are the same for many years. So there's no point to build an end-to-end test if it's always going to do the same. However, other systems are very dynamic. They get changes, they apply changes many, many times. So in these cases, these changes, an end-to-end test might be better. And an end-to-end test, the main difference is that you're actually building some automation that will make the real trigger in that third-party system. And your trigger will trigger the integration, which will run. Then that same test will be able to verify that the system has accepted the inputs. And then it can even go back and verify that the message, the original DFNO system, for example, send a callback state, which means sends a response. So it's a full end-to-end business process test, same as a user would be doing it from start to finish. In this case, the benefits are clear. You do a full end-to-end test. You test all of your triggers. You can sign off end-to-end business processes. And you can also test any connections, right? Sometimes there can be that the connection is just not available. So with this, you would be able to test it out. So this works very well in all the cases. The only real kind of let's say downside here is that it can be difficult to achieve. So in this case, you will need to use some kind of tool that is able to connect to these different applications and is able to do different kinds of actions. Now, there are multiple of these tools available. So I will just kind of introduce you or show you some of those that we have used in the past. However, there definitely can be more, and there definitely can be more alternative ones. I'm just going to show you the ones that from the Microsoft stack that you can use today. So in this case, all of our integrations, they become a bit more simpler in the scenarios. The whole point is, for example, if you're using web-based communication tools, so you're sending messages via data entities, or you're sending business events, or you're using custom services, any kind of web-based communication. And your other system, if it's a web portal, that means you can access it via the web, then you can use a recorder. There are many available recorders that record a desktop or a browser session, and you can record it directly in FNO since it's a browser. You can then record it in your other third-party portal. And with those recordings, you can then check data from one system into the other, right? So in this case, you make kind of the desktop recorders, web client recorders, and when you run these sessions, you can verify that the data that you have received is all correct. The only so probably you know RSAT. RSAT runs the same way. The only difference with RSAT is that currently, in this current version, it only runs in FNO. It runs in the current desktop session, so in the current browser session. So you can't go to some kind of third-party vendor portal and verify that your data that you have clicked, that you triggered the trigger, it actually received it, right? So that's the kind of the limitations. But there are some other recordings that you can use, and with these it's much easier, and you can do these end-to-end tests. Another scenario which is very common is when you have on-premise applications. So usually it's either a cloud application that you need to sign into with a browser, or it's an on-premise application that it's a application that runs on a server. In on-premise applications, you can use desktop automation tools. Desktop automation tools, there's a lot of them. Microsoft has Power Automate and Power Automate Desktop. Both of these could be used to automate a workflow within your within your desktop. So for example, if you have some expense management system that the users sign in, you can automate the sign-in and checking of the data in that expense management system. Or maybe if the expense management system produces a file, you can open that file with Power Automate Desktop, and you can verify the contents. And the whole point is that Power Automate and Power Automate Desktop can both connect to FNO right? And you can verify whether your file or your content or anything that you did is actually seen in the FNO system, right? So you perform the trigger directly in the desktop, and then with Power Automate Desktop, you can check, okay, this is the input data, and then it verifies whether that message was received in the FNO system. Right? So it depends what kind of scenarios we're looking at. But in both cases, it would be possible if you're integrating with an on-premise application or you're integrating with a cloud application. These are the two kind of main scenarios. So here I've provided some samples that, for example, we did in the past. We have automated some tests using Power Automate Desktop and Power Automate. So this is RPA, or robotic process automation. And in this case, you can automate like physical file opening, generating files, taking the file in the outcomes, and then going back to the cloud and verifying if everything is as it should be, verifying if everything works, and verifying if everything, you can see everything correctly. The robotic process automation, it can be called within the sys-test case framework, and it can be used for Azure DevOps solutions. What does that mean? Sys-test case, this is purely for FNO developers, if there are any in the call. Sys-test case is the default test generation framework in X++, which can be used to create automated tests. And then you can run these in Azure DevOps every night, every day, or every release. So the point is that you can actually create a fully automated test, put in Power Automate calls or Power Automate Desktop calls within that test, and you can run it from an Azure DevOps application during a build, and it can connect to your on-premises if there's correct setup. You can connect to your on-premises to verify if those checks are matching and if everything works as expected. An easier way is on the right side. This is a C# NUnit framework, which can be used for Selenium testing and WebDrivers. This is, in short, this is your browser recordings. So RSAT works essentially on a very similar framework. It works on the Selenium testing framework. It's just that this framework can be codable. So that means that a developer can write a code, a test, where in the test he calls a new browser session, where the browser session opens. It signs into some third-party portal, for example, where you upload your AP invoices or some kind of expense management system. They sign in as an online solution, right? Then they can do a trigger, like create a new vendor invoice, for example. And then in the same test, you can then go to FNO, because you're running in FNO, and verify if you see that new vendor invoice that was uploaded in that system to appear in FNO, right? So in one scope, you can create a browser session, do some steps, and during those steps, you do the triggers. And in the same session, you can verify that FNO has received those messages or have received those connections. Also, this can be done directly in sys-test case framework. So that means that you can put it again in Azure DevOps. And by putting it in Azure DevOps, you can run these tests every night. So imagine like running every night automated integration tests where you verify that integration works. So this could be even done for when developers are building modifications, and they can always verify that integrations work all the time, right? So then you have very limited chance that something would go wrong during creating new changes. The downside of both of these is that these are pretty technical. It might require some technical effort to implement, and that's kind of the main downside. They work, but you need to spend some time to dig into it. So what does Microsoft think about that, right? So Microsoft's current toolbox as it is today, this is the full kind of toolkit of all of the tools that we have for various kinds of testing. If you take a closer look in all of these, there is no one dedicated tool for integration tests. We have tests for regression tests, we have tests for data, unit testing, we have performance testing, we have all kinds of these tests, but we don't have a dedicated toolkit that would go and do our integration testing. So in this case, what is kind of the bad thing is that we don't have a dedicated toolbox. The good thing is that there's actually one coming up. So RSAT will get a new improvement, and this is taking strictly from the docs website, where our RSAT tool should be able to support a end-to-end integration scenario, where it will allow to run sessions for third-party applications that run before or after FNO is run. Essentially, you will be able to trigger an integration in some portal and then verify the outcomes in FNO. It's the same as you would be doing this with the development toolkits, with the NUnit framework, right? But in this case, you won't probably require coding, right? So the same tool will be extended to support these kind of scenarios. The whole point is to be able to do integration scenario testing and be able to do that without developer help. Because currently, if you want to do an end-to-end test, you need to do coding, which, as you probably know, coding is in general expensive, right? And since it's very expensive, it's not something that customers really aim at. So we will get this feature in general availability and in public preview within the next few months. That is the current release. So that means that stay tuned, and we will see what this can offer, right? Hopefully, this will be able to solve some of those issues. And since I haven't seen it yet, right? So we will see how it looks. And hopefully, we will be able to integrate and automate integration tests with some different websites, at least. Probably we won't be able to integrate with some on-premise applications since it's too difficult, but at least some of those scenarios might be covered extra. So then later on, maybe we will get even more of these tools. So for this, I will say to stay tuned, and hopefully we will get a out-of-the-box toolkit that will provide us with some of these scenarios and integration tests. Right, so at the end of the day, you will need to make a choice. Each integration that is built, it always has some end-to-end scenario and it has some technology underlying. So once the design is made and the implementation is made, you need to start thinking, how do we maintain it? To be honest, you should already start thinking during the design phase, but sometimes in reality, we only do the maintenance section after we implement it. So which to choose really depends on the actual integration scenario. Sometimes manual can make a lot of sense, since if you need to imagine if you need to build an integration test that is very, very difficult and it will require a lot of development time, then maybe it's much easier to simply dedicate it to manual testing, since in that case, automated tests should always be cheaper in the long term compared to manual testing, right? So if that doesn't work, then maybe manual testing is the way. Then you will need to answer some of these questions, like how difficult is the implementation for this test? Are there any out-of-the-box tools that are available? How often do we expect changes to come up? Is the solution reliable? And of course, does the solution provide value? By looking at each of those questions, you will be able to say, okay, so if the system is changing a lot, then we either do manual or end-to-end, because simulation doesn't work. It's not going to reflect the reality, right? If we don't have any out-of-the-box tools available, right? So for example, the Selenium testing doesn't work, RSAT doesn't work, robotic process automation doesn't work. So then you need to think of something very unique that maybe it's not available or it's very difficult. So then again, the answer might be that the manual test for that specific integration might be the key. By looking at these questions, we can decide which of those work, and then we can decide what is best for each integration. And it definitely can be that one integration you will do a manual test, for other you will do a full end-to-end test, and for other it might be that you will simply do a simulation test. And that is totally fine. That is something that can be fully done. Yes, so this is what I wanted to show you, talk about, and maybe raise some thoughts, right? So this is something that you can later take home to your organizations and ask the teams what kind of testing for our integrations are we implementing? Are we implementing at all any kinds of tests? Are we not doing anything, or are we using something else? If we look at the poll questions or poll answer, we can see that the majority of you have answered that manual testing is the biggest one. Then at the second and third place, we have X++ tests and third-party apps, and very small, don't do any kind of testing. So that means that X++ testing and third-party apps are coming in second, and manual testing is still at the top. And I can fully kind of understand that. Integration testing is more difficult than normal testing in terms of automation. So sometimes manual testing does make sense, right? But the long-term strategy, of course, would be to aim at more and more of these integrations. Maybe with X++, maybe with third-party apps, maybe it will be RSAT, and try to automate these as much as possible, right? As automation will, of course, bring value in the long term. And key to understand that these changes, these updates, and changes in modifications, they're not going to go away, right? So having as much as possible automated, it will help the customer organizations in the long term by saving a lot of costs. So that said, this is what I wanted to speak about, right? Our time, we still have like 9 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and I will have a look at it. So so we have a few questions that have come in. First question is it normal that in the sys test, oh, we even have it on the screen, nice. Is it normal that in the sys test data created via test run is in random partition numbers generating? I ran some tests and data was in 3 different partitions generated. What if I prepare custom DB setup, restore the never task and pipeline, one sys test and the one sys test case to work with that data? If I understand correctly, sys test data created in test run is in random partition numbers. So I haven't, to be honest, I haven't experienced that it would be in random partition numbers. Usually when I ran the sys tests cases, all the times they use the same partition, which was kind of the same one. One thing that I would suggest to do in this case is in the sys test cases, they have these attributes for saving data. So I don't remember how they're called, but essentially you can specify that you either save data during this sys test run, then you don't save data, then you save it in a specific way, and so on. So you can try playing around with these different options, the different parameters, and maybe that will solve it, right? Maybe that will solve it so that you don't get these different partitions runs. Usually when I run it, I specify which kind of legal entity to use all the time. And then I never save the data. And then I can run my task kind of successfully. But it might be that it's missing maybe one of those parameters. The second question is that what would be the user license needed for this tool, both D365 and Visual Studio? If you're referring, so it depends which kind of tool we are referring to. If you're referring to the sys test cases, the sys test case doesn't need any additional licenses. You can just kind of, run it and use it. If the tool is RSAT, let me see, maybe you specified. Yeah, RSAT. So RSAT in general, it doesn't. When you run RSAT, you are specifying which user are you running RSAT, which user kind of sign-in information is it using. So for RSAT and test cases runs, you don't need any specific user licenses. You can rerun the tool as an existing user, and then it will just run in the session as if or as that user. right? Licenses in general case, they're only needed for users that do stuff on production, right? So production-based operations, the people that are creating the sales orders, and so on and so on. For user license, you don't need anything. The one thing that you would need is not a user license, but you would need in the Azure DevOps, you need the sys-test license, which is called, I think, basic user plus test. There's a few others, but basic user plus test, so that you can create test cases in DevOps, and you can publish those, and you can essentially create your test cases, test plans. Otherwise, RSAT will not work. But besides that, the user doesn't have to have a specific license to run your RSAT tools, as you're not actually doing business. You're just testing it. Right? Okay, you already used these attributes, didn't help. Normally it works as never saying. Yeah, I think it normally works that it never saves it, but we would need to probably investigate deeper. Hard to say why is it using different partitions. Maybe you can force. Maybe there's some code that can force to use which one specific one, but I haven't encountered that in my in my cases. Is there any other questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, then to kind of finalize, feel free to check out our checklist. We have this handout. It's essentially a built-in material kind of a checklist to see where you can use automated updates and where automated updates become an issue. So feel free to check it out in the handout section. You can download it, just give it a read through. Maybe you'll find something relevant, something interesting. And that's it. I'm very thankful for joining, so that you have joined this session. If you'll be interested in hearing anything from us or making any kind of requests, feel free to give us an email, and we can help you with answering your questions, maybe related to automated testing or maybe related to general kind of other situations. So just give us an email and we'll come back to you. And the email is service@companion.com if you will need anything. That's it. I thank you all for joining. I'll just double check if there are no more questions. No, there are no more questions. So thank you all for joining. Hopefully you find this short session useful. Maybe learn something new. Maybe you can bring something home to your organizations. And maybe we'll talk again in the future. So thank you all, and see you on the next calls. Have a great rest of the day and great upcoming weekend.